Okay, so Tucker made a appearance at a recent Turning Point event, and I really loved the way that they did the intros. Now, I didn't watch every speaker. I was really only watching to see what Tucker had to say, and I was not expecting the Q&A portion, so that was probably the most entertaining part of this event. Now, what was really cool about the intro was that they basically had clips of Charlie Kirk playing, and for Tucker, what he did was they had a collab together where they did a interview. They played the clip of Charlie Kirk basically introducing Tucker to the stage, and they used that as his introduction to this event. It was really cool because they were obviously including Charlie Kirk in everything that they're doing as far as this particular event. I have not been watching other stuff that they've been doing. I'm not surprised that they did that, but I love how well done it was. And we can go ahead and watch that because I really love the music. It's upbeat and it's just really on point, and it makes the moment that more special and meaningful.
Tucker Carlson. Tucker, come on out here.
That's a really nice beat. And you can just see all of the people in the crowd and all of that stuff. And then he did come out with his two dogs. So they were just walking all over the place, which is totally fine and stuff like that. And at one point he was like, hey, who has my dog? Does someone in the audience have my dog or whatever? And so that was just really funny. So I did like the intro. I love the music. And I'm not sure what the vibe is normally for Turning Point events, but this was a good episode to watch. And so I am excited to get into it. Now, the other thing that I want to highlight about this portion overall of Tucker Carlson speaking, his dad did come up and he was not happy about it. And so the guy, I think, just brought it up in passing, but he was like, your dad was in the CIA, blah, blah, blah. And we know that that's a big deal just because of the whole beef with Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes. And he did not take kindly to that. He's like, don't bring up my dad again. We're going to fight, basically. And so he was just really like, don't try me, son, because this is not going to end well for you because I love my dad. I'm going to defend him, obviously, right? He just basically warned everybody else not to bring up his dad. And I also thought it was funny because throughout the Q&A portion, he had to preface his answer by saying, hey, I'm going to take you seriously. And so the implication there is that this is not a serious question or this is not something that you really need me to spell out for you. But I'm glad that he once said, hey, I'm going to take your question seriously, and then gave an answer, because if this was something that you were wondering and you didn't want to ask or something like that, having somebody actually answer the question helps you put together the pieces. And so I'm glad that he kind of, made it obvious that you should know the answer to this, but if you don't, I am going to take the time to give you the answer. And I do want to add here that the Q&A portion did frustrate me because these are obviously young adults and they were just going back and forth way too much. They didn't just ask like their two questions and keep it moving. Some of them did, but there were three people I think who were two were definitely annoying, and then the third one, he was trying to be polite, but he was also kind of getting into troll mode a little bit. And so the Q&A portion was very frustrating because people just kept going back and forth for too long, and then at one point it was just one girl asking the same question 5 different ways, which is super annoying. So let's go ahead and get into what they talked about. This is Heyybritny. Welcome back. Alrighty, so first they talked about the right being fractured. So they really talked about how after everything that happened with Charlie Kirk, how the right is really divided. They're also trying to eliminate the infighting on the right, but they're also kind of not willing to settle beef with people outside of the right party, of the Republican Conservative Party. And so that's been super interesting to witness. And what Tucker pointed out is that basically Charlie was the one who kind of brought everybody together, I think, within the right, but then also in a general sense. He was really good at, in his debates, he would try to find common ground with people to say, hey, we agree on this, but it looks like we don't agree on that. And that's always a better way to approach it, because when you're just focusing on what you guys disagree on or what you guys are not aligned with, it's easier to see the other person as an enemy, not like them, not want to find common ground with them. You really want to focus on the things that you don't have in common. And so right now they are missing that element. And I've only seen maybe 1 or 2 kind of Q&A sessions from people at Turning Point USA who are obviously trying to continue what Charlie Kirk does. And I don't know if they do it. I don't think they do it as effectively as Charlie Kirk does. And so you can see here where one is just frustrating talking to young adults. And it's almost like a parent talking to their child, but you are an adult talking to other people's kids. And it's almost like you feel like you're a teacher where you deal with kids all day, you deal with craziness, stupidness, you deal with kids who are really good and well behaved and smart and all of that stuff, but there is a downside to that when you have to deal with kids who aren't motivated to learn and all of that stuff. And so you can kind of see all of that coming to a head in these Q&A sessions. And if you don't have the person up there who is willing to take the time and listen and actually have meaningful conversations with these kids, with these young adults, it does become frustrating. So Tucker obviously got frustrated throughout this Q&A portion, and I didn't like that he kept apologizing for getting frustrated or for cursing or whatever, because this is not his thing. Yes, he takes Q&A questions, but not this way where you have young kids who are just trying to troll you and trying to get their gotcha moment or try to one-up you and whatever, right? And so that is not what a lot of these people who are podcasters, YouTubers, that sort of thing, political commentators, they're not used to having to deal with young kids who are that way. And when you're dealing with young kids or young adults, you treat them a little bit differently than you would treat a normal grown person who should know better. And so that's just been an interesting dynamic to see. Now, the other thing that he talked about was basically defining what MAGA is, so Make America Great, and he was basically saying that since Trump came around in the political scene 10 years ago, there's been 5 things that define MAGA: America First, no pointless wars, jobs, immigration, and free speech. So free speech was the most interesting thing that he brought up out of all of those 5 different things. And this really tied into America's identity, why people come to America, because you can say whatever you want, you can express your beliefs and your different opinion. Other people may not agree with you or like what you say, but you have the right to say it. And so that is a big thing, especially in America, because you do not have that freedom everywhere outside of America. And then the other thing that they talked about was in terms of, I guess, power in politics. He was basically saying that you don't want to be controlled by people who are part of agencies, 3-letter agencies basically, where they have secret funding. You don't know who's popping them up. You don't know why they're doing what they're doing. And so basically he was saying that that was a dangerous thing. But this also ties into his dad, because his dad was CIA. And so he obviously excluded his dad from that statement that he was making. But what he was speaking to is bad to be controlled by people when you don't know why they're motivated to do the things they're doing, who's funding them, and who's pushing them in that direction. And I think at this point, we do have people asking questions about the FBI, different intelligence agencies, and what they're doing, how they're maneuvering the general public to think about certain topics or certain issues, and what they want the narrative to be. And then you always have those people who are conspiracy theorists, people who are kind of going against the grain and trying to figure out any little bit of thing that they can that goes against the official narrative. And so that's always been an interesting dynamic. You've always had the rich, the powerful, and then the underdog, or the people who are kind of more aware of what's going on than like the average person would be. So you're always going to have those 3 different groups: the people in power, the average people, and the people who are kind of really tuned into what is actually going on. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about spiritual entities, and I'm just going to go ahead and play the clip.
I'm not going to find out. I've got enough problems. I don't want to know. But anyway, the point is, I was born that year, and for my entire life up until recently, like, no one I knew in my world, which is like, you know, coastal, affluent, well-educated, not that I'm well-educated, but everyone else around me is, no one ever like talked about God at dinner. That was like the spiritual realm was like kind of a joke that like is kind of a trailer park belief or who knows what.
I want to pause it here because basically he's leading into the topic of spirituality, and he's basically talking about how with the world that we live in, or like when he was growing up and all of that stuff, people were religious, but they didn't think about religion the same way that people did thousands of years ago, where they were just more connected to the spiritual world, the spiritual energy in the world that we live in. And so that's just super interesting for him to kind of not necessarily tie it all together, but just bring that out in the open, because people do kind of think you're crazy when you talk about this stuff.
They're handling snakes, they make TV shows about, like, no one believed that. And when you don't believe that, you kind of miss everything, because it is real, whether you want it to be or not. That's literally real. It's absolutely real. It's as real as this podium. And so to someone living even 100 years ago, the idea that these are, of course, angels, demons, they're manifestations of the spiritual battle ongoing since the beginning of time.
I want to pause it here because this is what he's saying about how people right now really doubt like aliens, demons, and all that stuff. They don't think it's real. But he's saying, of course it's real. How could you not believe that? People 100 years ago, they believe that.
That would have been obvious. And instead we're like, maybe they flew in rocket ships from Mars. Do we have a telescope powerful enough to detect that? Oh, shut up. You're missing the obvious, dude. So.
I found that really funny because obviously if there are things that have been around since before the people who currently live on Earth or in the universe are here, it's kind of arrogant to think, oh, we don't have the technology to discover whatever is out there, so therefore it doesn't exist. And that's been super interesting because I know that we have a lot of the government officials, Congress, having kind of hearings where they're talking about what's actually out there. And I did see one kind of either clip or something like that on social media where it's basically saying that somebody saw something like as big as a football field kind of going like 200 miles per hour or something like that at the bottom of the ocean, and obviously they didn't know what it was, but they know that something was there. And so that's just super interesting to have people kind of realize that we're not the only ones here and what that actually is. People have different opinions. So some people think it's aliens from a different planet, other people think it's demons and all of that stuff. And so it is super fascinating when you hear about that, because one thing that people talked about was that there are people who are religious who don't believe in that sort of thing, but then other people will say, well, if you believe in good, then you also have to acknowledge that bad exists. You're kind of denying that the bad exists by saying, oh, demons aren't real and all of that stuff. And so anyway, super interesting conversation. And what he also brought up to tie it back to religion is he was basically talking about how this is included in sacred text, not just the Bible, but in other cultures, they have sacred texts that talk about aliens, demons, spiritual energy, the spiritual world, and all of that stuff. And so what he ties this to is that because we kind of have godlike powers as far as like the government and all of that stuff, we've kind of removed ourselves from that spiritual world and spiritual energy to where we think that we control everything and we don't. And so that ties into some of the blindness that we have about what's actually going on in the world and the fact that we're not the only people here. And so what he's really hitting on is that in modern time, we're not as religious, we're not as spiritual, and we are having a resurgence of religion, especially with everything that happened to Charlie Kirk and how religious he was. And I think that that's important because people talk about Christianity, like true biblical Christianity, and then they also talk about Christian nationalism and how that's not good. And so you just want to make sure that whatever you are following as far as religion, Christianity, the Bible, God, all of that stuff, you want to make sure that you're doing it for the right thing and you're learning the right things from it. And so it's been super interesting for me to watch different videos on YouTube of people having these conversations about what the Bible means, how people may be twisting the Bible to fit whatever agenda they're trying to accomplish. And if you don't know what's in the Bible, it's hard for you to really understand that people are doing that they're twisting the Bible and they're trying to accomplish something that doesn't actually benefit mankind or the world at large. Next up, they talked more about speech, but they also talked about buzzwords. I'm just going to go ahead and play that clip.
About wokeism, and it's the most powerful people suppressing the lesser powerful. There's cases where it's people that you typically agree with, where it's powerful people suppressing the lesser powerful.
I want to pause it here. So just to give you some of the backstory. So this is a girl, she kind of annoyed me at this point in the QA session, or just when she was speaking during the QA portion. She asked him about the word wokeism, or being woke basically. And I didn't like the definition that he gave, because he basically said woke is just a way for the powerful people to get the less powerful people to shut up. And that's not really what woke is. If you're talking about the Black community, woke is just being aware of social injustices and just kind of fighting back against that. But woke has also been kind of hijacked to mean that if you are woke, that you're kind of accepting of all of these different situations, and that's not necessarily the case, because people are saying that if you support gay rights, if you support transgenderism, if you support the Black community and all of these different social issues, that means that you're woke. And really what it means, if you go back to its core, is that you're just aware of social injustices, like true social injustices. And so because he answered it that way, I think he kind of set himself up for this conversation, because this conversation wasn't really about him. It was more about Trump and the No Kings protest and AI and all of that stuff. And we can just let the clip continue playing.
That may be absolutely true. I like Elon. I'm not endorsing everything he does.
So, but that's you endorsing a more powerful individual. Why are you only against the more powerful when it's supporting things like human rights and BLM, but you're for it when it's supporting Donald Trump?
Well, I don't know that I am. I mean, I think we may have a failure of, as usual, of me to explain myself fully.
I want to pause it. I don't think the issue is that he's not explaining himself clearly. She's just trying to argue something completely different. And so what he's basically talking about, I think he was talking about, is it NGOs and basically how they will kind of push different agendas, and he's against that. And then she's saying, oh, well, you have rich people who fund their different movements and you're okay with that. And so I think there's a different argument that is being made in what both of them are saying. And obviously she's not really listening to what he's saying, but I think that she does have a valid point. Like, if it shouldn't matter it shouldn't matter what the agenda is. If you are against rich people funding stuff or whatever, then you should be against it no matter who's doing the funding and what the agenda is. So I'll just leave that there.
So I think you're speaking about two different categories. The first category was free speech and who's funding the efforts to suppress it. And I would say free speech benefits, by definition, the powerless. So like, if you don't have a lot of money and clearly your vote isn't going to turn an election, what do you have? You have your conscience, you have your voice. So traditionally, and this is why it's enshrined in the Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech is the weapon of the powerless. It's all they have, is their voice. That's it. Okay? And their ability to assemble and petition and make noise and all that, right? This is what liberals used to say all the time, and I always agree with them.
So what Tucker is really trying to impress on people is that freedom of speech is so important. You need to be able to speak your mind regardless of how much money you have and what your job is and all of that stuff, what your role in society is. What you have at bare minimum is the ability and the freedom to say whatever you think. So what this girl was trying to tie all of this to was basically, she did not like the fact that Trump did that AI video of him pooping all over people who were protesting. She thought that that was bad for the leader of the country to do, and I think most people can agree with that, but most people also find it funny, even though it kind of was an unnecessary meme, if that makes sense. But then also at the same time, what she is saying is that by Trump posting that meme, he was preventing other people from exercising their free speech when they were at the No Kings protest, and that's not really the same. And he goes on to say this, I'm just not playing a clip of it. And basically what he's saying is that literally him posting that meme doesn't prevent other people from saying or doing whatever they want. Now, what she's more so trying to argue is the consequences or the effect of him posting that meme, which is that the people who are protesting are going to feel angry, upset. They're not going to like that he's doing that. They may feel shame that people are mocking them for protesting, and those feelings may either make them want to protest more or kind of make them not want to protest because they don't want to deal with those negative emotions that come with being humiliated, mocked, and all of that stuff. And so I think that that's a completely different argument, because him posting a meme does not prevent you from speaking. It's your reaction to the meme that would prevent you from speaking up about whatever issues are important to you. And I didn't like this girl during the Q&A portion, because I think she went back and forth with him too much to where she almost didn't let him speak at times. And there's other people telling her what to say or how to rebut whatever Tucker said. And so in that sense, it wasn't her using her own brain to kind of push back on what he was saying. She was getting help from other people. And so I didn't like that, because if you're going to argue something, let it be your own ideas that you're arguing and hold your own weight in this conversation with Tucker. And so this was kind of like a misplaced kind of frustration with like the administration and the people who are in power because she got mad at Tucker for whatever the previous speaker said about some joke that he made, and so she tried to hold Tucker accountable for it, and then obviously Tucker is not responsible for whatever Donald Trump does, and so she tried to bring that up, and so you're in a sense blaming people except the one person who is doing that, right? You're trying to make everybody else condemn what he's doing instead of just condemning the person who is doing it. Then we had the French guy who came after this girl, and he set it up as if he was a fan of Tucker and was going to kind of have, like, I guess, a normal debate. Instead, he kind of flattered him in the beginning and then just launched kind of all of these they weren't even difficult questions, but awkward questions, trying to force Tucker to answer the question a certain way and then just kind of not liking his answers and just being overly difficult. And so this was definitely really frustrating to watch. And I did see a clip of this exchange on social media. They felt like he got flustered or didn't know how to handle the question or was just put on the spot and wasn't prepared for it. And really, I think it could be a combination of two things. He wasn't prepared to account for his past behavior, but I also think that the kid was there to troll him and to be difficult, and this wasn't a genuine debate. So I do have a clip kind of showing some of the energy because I feel like I would have to play the whole thing in order for you to really understand how annoying this part of the segment was.
I'm happy to admit how dumb they were. I've spent the last 22 years trying to atone for my support for the Iraq War.
I appreciate that. And like,
hold on, I'm not, okay, now you're annoying me again.
Oh my God.
Not here for your affirmation. So I would say, as to the text specifically, you want to actually know? I mean, are you even willing to hear it? I'll tell you exactly what that was. Those were between me and a producer of mine who I really love.
Let me pause it here. So the kid asked him about him basically going along with the narrative that the election was stolen. And basically what he ends up revealing is that he had a source who told him, hey, 8 dead people voted. And then those people who were supposed to be dead, they ended up calling the news station where he worked to say, hey, we're not dead. And so his reputation took a hit because he didn't verify what the person told him. And so this French kid is holding him accountable for having a huge platform, the number one platform at the time, and basically pushing disinformation. And so Tucker is trying to acknowledge that and explain kind of what happened there.
What I still am close to. And that was it was in January after the election, and Trump was saying they stole it from me. And
So the rest of that clip wasn't really relevant. I really just wanted you to kind of see some of the energy between him and the French kid to kind of understand why people were talking about that moment. Okay, next up, they had 2 women. Only one of them really spoke, and they were really pushing Tucker on Christianity, the laws in America, and kind of how it's not good to force other people to be Christian. Basically is kind of what they were getting at. And so I did find this portion to be very interesting just because of the answers that Tucker gave. And there are some things that I don't agree with, but I'm going to play the clip so that we can get a general sense of what they talked about in this part of the segment.
For a platform that advocates for limited government and personal freedoms, how do you justify the imposition of Christian values and beliefs onto a secular nation that was founded on the separation of church and state?
Well, I guess I don't see a lot of imposition of Christian values. I wish we had a lot more. The country was founded on Christian values.
You wish that we had laws?
Okay, I want to pause it here because I feel like this is a little bit of a confusing answer because she's saying, how are you basically pushing Christianity on people when this is a secular country? And then he's like, well, there's no imposition of Christian values. And then actually he wishes it was more. And so that's a little bit of a confusing answer. I think he becomes a little bit more clear as he continues to answer this question. And so I did find that interesting because if you are a secular nation, and this is why we don't have anyone forced to participate or believe any one religion, you can believe whatever or practice whatever religion you want. And so in that sense, that is an interesting question. But if you go back to what people were practicing when this country was founded, you will see that a lot of it was based on some type of religion, whether or not we actually today have to practice that same religion to the same degree, if that makes sense.
I'm sorry?
You wish that our country had laws based on Christianity that would...
All of our laws are based on Christianity. All of them.
And do you think that's a good thing?
Okay, I want to pause it here because this I feel like is a more clear answer than what he gave in the first 20 to 30 seconds of this clip, where he kind of waffled a little bit, and then here he's saying, no, our laws are based on Christianity, that's not a problem, what are you getting at? We'll let her continue her question.
Right, well, it's the essential thing. It's why we're America. All of our laws are based on Christianity. Not sectarian Christianity, not Protestant Christianity, Catholic Christianity, Orthodox Christianity.
Secular country with...
It's not actually a secular country. Have you looked at the dollar bill?
I found this super funny because if you are someone who uses cash, you see kind of that language and what's on the dollar bill and all of that stuff by other bills as well. And so I did find that interesting because I use my phone to pay all of the time, so I rarely touch cash. And so if you have kids who are growing up that way and living that way to where they don't know what's on a quarter, they don't know what's on a dollar and all of that stuff, they're not going to have that same connection to understanding that when America was founded, when people were writing their documents and all of that stuff, putting cash together, there was a religious kind of motivation behind all of that. But when you get removed from that, you can't really see where these laws and where these documents are coming from. To you, it's just a law, it's just a document, and you don't really understand the backstory or the history or the significance behind it.
No, it's not a secular country. Our founding documents have God all over them. In fact, that's the point of our founding documents. I don't know if you've read them, you should.
Do you not believe in the separation of church and state?
Once again, and this is why I do worry about college, because the thought process does seem less rigorous than it ought to be. There is
Okay, so that's what I was talking about with him making that comment about, I'll take your question seriously. And so obviously he's dealing with, I think, 3 or 4 kids at this point who are really kind of pushing back and not asking silly questions, but they're asking repetitive questions, and they're really trying to fixate on whatever the point they're trying to get across. And that is frustrating when you're trying to answer the question and they're just spinning the question in a different way as if you didn't answer. And so that's really frustrating. And so that girl, she does that throughout this part of the segment. She asked the same question 5 different ways in my opinion, and that was kind of frustrating, but I'm glad that he answered the question because that helps other people who may be thinking the same thing just based on what I said about me not using cash. If you grew up not using cash, you're not really going to understand the way older people would who didn't grow up the way that you are now growing up or living. Now, I thought that the point about a secular nation and then how the laws are rooted in Christianity, I found that to be super interesting because yes, we can live in America. We're not forced to practice any one religion, but I think we all know that there are kind of like public schools, there's private schools, and then there's Christian schools. So what it means to have separation of church and state, in my opinion, is that we know that some people go to Christian schools, not everybody is required to. If there were no separation of church and state, I feel like everyone would feel like they went to a Christian middle school, elementary school, high school, college, that sort of thing. You would be more kind of absorbed in the world of religion if there was no separation of state. And so that's not something that they talked about quite like that, but that is what hit my mind when they started talking about this, and how I started to think about the topic of what does it really mean to have America culturally be the way it is, and then what does it mean in terms of how America was founded and the fact that laws are kind of rooted in Christianity. And so there's some people who don't really understand. Like, for example, I honestly did not understand what Christian schools were all about. I didn't understand, like, you obviously take Bible study classes, but then you learn regular topics. I just didn't know kind of how that all flowed together. And so I found that super interesting growing up, the fact that some people went to Christian schools and some went to just public schools or regular private schools and all of that stuff. And so I didn't really know what the difference is. And again, if you don't grow up that way, you're not really understanding how other people live the world and how they experience the world because you've grown up very differently. And so I do think that this is a good question for young people to ask because they are growing up in a completely different world than the world that I grew up. The early 2000s is completely different from 2025. Now, also on this topic, the other thing that came up was what makes America different from other countries. And he was saying that America is the only country that doesn't do collective punishment. And so he was kind of trying to say that people like America for that, they come to America for that. And I think for some people who may experience that, that is why they are drawn to America. But I think for most people, it's about the freedom of speech, it's about opportunities. And I don't really think about, oh, I want to go to America or I want to continue to live in America because I'm not going to be punished for what other people do. And so that could be because I have not grown up being punished for what other Black people do or being punished for what my family does and all of that stuff in a legal sense, because I think socially, if your family member does something really bad, like a school shooting, the whole family suffers from it socially. But in a legal sense, it's just, well, depending on how involved your parents were, because we did see that one school shooting where the parents got arrested for one providing the gun and then whatever else, right? And so you kind of do see people being collectively punished for, as far as the family, for a crime, but generally that doesn't happen. And so my point is, I don't know if that is what people think of first when they think of America. I think they more so think of the land of opportunities. But again, what opportunities are you talking about? That can kind of depend on where you're from, what you dealt with growing up. So if you are tired of being punished for what other people do, you might want to be more like a individualistic person. If you grew up not having many job opportunities and you think you're going to get more opportunities in America, if you want to own a home and you think there's more opportunities to buy a home in America, that sort of thing. So it just really depends on your background, what you've been through, and how you see America. But I think most people see it as the land of opportunity rather than about the legal system or collective punishment. Now, next up, I want to play a clip of them basically talking about what holds a country, and this gets into a topic of immigration and how when you have people coming from different countries and different cultures and not really understanding what America is, you don't really have that glue that holds everyone together. The glue is not as strong, and so I just want to play a clip of him talking about that.
Justification for things that are moral, for things that are not the same that everyone believes in.
Well, you've got a broader problem here, and I will take your question seriously because I think it's a serious question. You have a problem in any country where there's no working majority of people who share something in common. And we have that now because of immigration. And if there's anything that will destroy the country, it's that. You need to have a shared sense of something. It can't just be, oh, we love the gays, that's enough. It's not enough. That's not enough, whether you love the gays or not. That's not like a reason for a country to hold together.
You think the reason should be?
So I found that interesting because what he's really saying is that, I guess in a sense, social issues are not what hold a country together, or a specific social issue is a combination of different things, or it's something that's a little bit more broad than just caring about one social issue, right? And so I do find that interesting because we do have people who are one issue voters and that's the one thing that they care about. But in terms of what brings us all together, it would probably be the fact that in America you can basically not necessarily do whatever you want. We do have laws and stuff like that, but we operate completely different from other countries. And it's so interesting when you hear the stories about people who grew up in America and they moved to other countries and they hate it, or they didn't realize how different it was going to be. And so I do find that interesting when you think about what is it that holds America together. Some people got mad when, I think it was Charlie Kirk or somebody who said, like, hey, if you put the Constitution in some random place, that would be America. And I don't think that is necessarily kind of true, at least for me. I think America is literally the land that we are in, the 50 states and all of that stuff, and what we've kind of achieved since people who were already living here achieved what they achieved, and then people who immigrated and settled here helped build America into what it is today. And so I just find it interesting that we don't really know what holds America together, and that would be definitely very interesting, trying to kind of reclaim that American identity. And I also love that the girl, because at the beginning of the clip, she was basically talking about how people weaponized or used religion to justify bad things. And I talked about that in another video where people hijack the religion, the Bible, to justify slavery. And obviously that's bad, but you also have to know what the Bible says and understand that that's what people did. There's nowhere in the Bible, some people would say, that justifies slavery. It's more so of God allowing people to see things that are bad and understand that even though you may have things that are bad that are happening, God wants to kind of put parameters or kind of barriers around it to keep it from being as bad as it could, if that makes sense. And so I do agree that people have weaponized religion in the Bible and all of that stuff, but you have to understand that means that those people who did that are bad, not that the Bible and religion is bad, if that makes sense. And so when they brought this up, this made me think of Game of Thrones, The Last Kingdom, and whatever other show it was, Vikings. It made me think of those three shows because all three shows had this weird kind of period where the people who were pagan got super into Christianity and religion, and it almost felt kind of demonic in a sense, and it was just kind of really kind of, I don't know, it was just an icky feeling, and I didn't enjoy those moments in those three different shows, and they all had them. And I think it's that idea of people kind of using religion to lord over people as if they're better than other people, as if they know better than people who practice other religions. And I think that you can feel that way regardless of what religion you practice. And so I just find that interesting that with Christianity resurging right now and people worried about Christian nationalism and all of that stuff, it is very important to make sure that whatever you are kind of trying to achieve, that is for a good reason when it comes to learning the Bible and growing in your faith and just kind of better understanding the world that we live in, because there are people who are going to lie to you, to mislead you, and to hijack religion and the Bible to steer you wrong. Okay, next up, they talked about abortion as a human sacrifice, and I found this topic to be most interesting because going back to the Vikings and the Last Kingdom, Vikings more so, I'm pretty sure there were a few scenes where they would have a baby and they would leave the baby in the woods or whatever, and then the baby would be gone the next morning or whatever. And so basically they're sacrificing their child to the gods that they believe in because they think it's going to bring good into their life, it's going to benefit them, it's going to make things easier, better for them. And so what Tucker is kind of arguing, back in the day, other cultures, they did sacrifice children to God. So that was me just bringing in a TV show to make it more clear what he's saying there. And what we have as a modern day equivalent is you have abortion. So that is a form of sacrificing your children, and you're not necessarily doing it for a God that you believe in, but you're doing it because you think it's going to better your life. You feel like you're not going to have to bear that responsibility of raising a child. And so even though the outcome looks different, the situation looks different, it's still about benefiting or bettering your life somehow. And I think that's what he's really trying to hit at. So let's go ahead and play a clip on them talking about abortion.
Obviously, and everyone knows that. And people are so into it because it's the same ritual that every civilization ever been studied has engaged in, which is human sacrifice. Obviously, why did the Incas, and it wasn't just the Incas, it was my ancestors, the Vikings, all of them killed people in order to appease the gods and give themselves more power.
Abortion isn't ritualistic.
Are you joking? They had an abortion truck outside the Democratic Convention. Well, you're here, maybe you could get an abortion. No, it's the most...
I want to pause it here because I don't know if it's ritualistic in the sense of going to church every Sunday. Like, that can be a ritual. I think it's more ritualistic if you have a woman who every time she gets pregnant, she goes and has an abortion. I feel like that is more ritualistic. But the fact that women turn to abortion when they think they need to make that decision, I don't think that that's a ritual necessarily. So that's interesting because it depends on how you define a ritual. Rituals can be good or bad, right? And so I do understand what he's arguing, but I understand why people wouldn't think it's a ritual, because when you think of a ritual, you think of something that you always kind of do no matter what. And I don't think that for a woman, every single time she gets pregnant, she thinks about getting an abortion, if that makes sense. But I'm not sure what you guys think about whether or not abortion is a ritual.
It's the most crazed level of fanaticism I've ever seen. Like when I was a kid, they would say, well, you know, there's probably some 12-year-old farm worker child who got raped and she's pregnant. Like, would you say to her she has to carry the baby? And I'd be like, oh, that's so sad. I can't, It makes me really sad. And like, I don't think she should have an abortion, but I get it. Now it's just like, no, abortion is the only right you have. It's all you have. You don't have the right to keep him from jabbing a needle in your arm with some unknown poison made by Pfizer. You don't have that right. You don't have the right to say what you really think. The only right you have is to murder your own kids? That's dark, dude. Listen to yourself. That's the saddest thing that could ever happen. Killing your children?
I want to pause it here because I'm not sure if he's going to say this in the rest of the clip, but basically he's saying that how abortion is not really about my body, my choice, because if you don't have a choice over whether you get the COVID vaccine, you should have that same issue. You should be against people mandating that you had to get the COVID vaccine because you should have a choice over what happens to your body. And obviously people lined up to get the COVID vaccination because they didn't want to be punished because they thought that was the only thing that they had to do, whatever, right? And so there were people who pushed back against that, who got kind of shunned and criticized and all of that stuff. And so you can see how people are arguing kind of the same issue, but their positioning is different depending on what the issue is. And so with abortion, you have control over your body, you can do whatever you want, but with something like COVID, no, you have to get the shot because you need to protect other people and all of that stuff, right? And so it's just interesting how people can think about issues depending on what the situation is.
The only thing in life, and I'm telling you this as a young person with the greatest sincerity, I mean this as a father of four, the only thing that matters is not your stupid job at Citibank. Trust me, it doesn't matter. All that matters is having children, and your children are all that will matter to you. I don't care what you say. I've lived it. I know that's true. And so anyone who's like, oh, just kill your children. You know, I feel like a lot of the problems, I'm sorry, Brookie, to upset you. Sorry. It's my dog.
So I find that super interesting because what he's talking about is, hey, you know, the world, it should really be about having kids, making sure that you leave a good world for them behind to live in, right? And so what he's also talking about is how people are just so willingly wanting to get abortions or turn to abortions as a solution to everything. And then he goes on to say, well, hey, you know, why don't they show you videos of people getting abortions because it's graphic, it's violent and all of that stuff, and that's not necessarily something that you want to see. It's almost the same as like people don't want to watch videos of women giving birth even though you're literally bringing life into the world, right? People don't want to see that, but it's for a very different reason than not wanting to see something being sucked out of a woman or killed or whatever, right? They're both graphic, but they're graphic for different reasons, right? And so I do find that interesting how people think about abortion because other people say, hey, you know, it's not a baby yet, it's not a human yet, and all of that stuff, so you don't think of it as killing. I don't think it's murder necessarily, but I do agree that you are killing something when you remove it, especially if you've heard the heartbeat, if you've seen it on the ultrasound, you kind of understand what is happening there and that there's something that is moving inside of you and it's not like an extension of you, it's separate from you and it's just inside of you until it can grow and be on its own once you give birth. And so anyway, okay, moving on, the next thing that I want to cover is congressional districting, and this ties into the video that I just did on Ketanji Brown Jackson, where she's basically talking about black voters and wanting to create a second black district, basically so black votes are not being diluted and people will be more likely, I guess, to vote for black candidates. And so there's a person who asked Tucker about this, and I don't have a clip on this, but basically he is asking Tucker what he thinks about this, and Tucker says that it's basically bad because it's going to lead to a race war. It's making people more divided than ever if you're only thinking about your race and you only think that someone who looks like you is qualified to represent your views or represent the things that you want for yourself to other people. And in some sense, I can understand that because if you are someone who is not taking the time to learn about other cultures, other religions, other racial groups, and all of that stuff, then you can't necessarily represent other people when they come to you with those perspectives of things that they care about that you may not necessarily be able to identify with, right? And so yes, you can represent someone on, hey, you know, I want my bills to be lower, I want to be able to afford a house, I want to be able to get a job. Those are all things that aren't tied to unique culture. Those are just basic living conditions or living situations that you want for yourself that anybody can have in common, right? And so I think when you think outside of that, yes, you do need someone who understands the different cultures and all of that stuff that people have. But if you have someone who doesn't reflect that, then it does make you feel like you don't have someone who represents you on a much deeper level. And so I do agree with what he's saying. It would lead to a race war. It is making us more divided than it should be, but I can also understand why that would be important to people. However, I don't think that you should encourage racism when you are going about trying to make sure that every vote counts, because you can't in a sense make people's votes count more just because they're a certain race or whatever, right? And so one of the things that came up was that they were talking about Indiana, and I think the person who was asking this question was saying that it's 60% Republican, 40% Democrat, and with the way that they're trying to draw the districts and all of that stuff, they're trying to make it 89% Republican and whatever. And so I don't really have the knowledge to know exactly what goes into that. I know that that's a huge topic when it comes to voting and the government and all of that stuff. And so what I do find interesting about that is I feel like in a sense it kind of balances out regardless of what's happening in your individual state. Like if you have a Republican state of Indiana, you might have a Democratic state of New York where things are in the opposite direction, they're done completely different. But I think in the end it sort of all balances out because each state, each area has its own unique way of thinking and way of voting, and I think it just balances itself out, if that makes sense. So I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, but hopefully if you have any thoughts on that, you can let me know in the comment section below. Alrighty, so that's the end of this video. I did enjoy this Q&A session. I had a lot of laughs. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it too. Now, as far as the topics that we covered, if there's anything that sticks out to you, definitely let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.